האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה?
Good evening, Erev Tov, Dobra Vayechi. We are in the Zera Shimshon on Parshas Vayechi, the last Parsha in Sefer Bereshis. We're going to do Os Tes Vav, that's section 15. And before we do, we're going to look at three psukim. The first pasuk is not in our Parsha. It's much earlier in the Torah. It's actually in Parshas Chayei Sarah. And this is Bereshis Perek Chaf Hey, pasuk Ches. This pasuk tells us about the death of Avraham Avinu, the patriarch Avraham. And the pasuk says, Vayigva Vayomos Avraham, and Avraham expired and he died. Beseva Tova Zokein Visaveya. He died at a very good old age, old and satisfied. Vayasef el amav, and he was gathered to his people. So that pasuk, it describes the death of Avram Avinu. Now we'll move to a pasuk in our parsha, which describes the death of Yaakov Avinu, and this is Perek Mem Tes pasuk Lamed Gimel in Parshas Vayechi. Vayechal Yaakov litzavos es bonav, and Yaakov finished commanding his sons. Vaye'esof raglov el hamita, and he gathered his feet to the bed. Vayigva, and he expired. Vaye'asef el amav, and he was gathered to his people. So with Avraham, there were three different terms that describe the death of Avram Avinu. There was Vayigva, that he expired. There was Vayomos, that he died, and then there was he was gathered to his people. However, in this pasuk that we just read about Yaakov, it only mentions two of those terms. It mentions Vayigva, he expired, and Vayasef el amav, and he was gathered to his people. But the Torah doesn't use the word Vayomos, and he died. The Torah doesn't say that Yaakov Avinu died, and we'll see the Zera Shimshon tell us what Chazal learned from that. Now, the last pasuk we're going to read before we begin is a pasuk also in our Parsha Vayechi, just a little bit later than the pasuk we just read, Perek Nun, pasuk Yud. And this pasuk is talking about when, after Yaakov passed away, his sons brought him up to the land of Canaan to bury him in the Maras HaMachpelah, in the cave of Machpelah. And it says, before they reached Eretz Canaan, Vayovo ad Goren Ha'atad, and they came to the threshing floor of thorns, meaning a threshing floor surrounded by thorn bushes. Asher Be'ever HaYarden, which was on the other side of the Yarden, meaning not inside the land of Canaan, outside of the land of Canaan. They came to that place. Vayispedu sham misped gadol v'chaved me'od, and they had a mourning, and they eulogized there, and they had a mourning period there that was heavy, very heavy and great. Vayas le'aviv evel shivas yamim, and Yosef arranged for there to be 7 days of mourning for his father Yaakov. And then as the pasuk goes, as the psukim continue, we see that Yosef and his brothers brought Yaakov Avinu's body into Eretz Canaan and buried him in the Maras HaMachpelah, in the cave of Machpelah. Those are the psukim. Now, let's get right into the Zera Shimshon now. Os Tes Vav, section 15. Gemara de Sota Perek Kama. The Gemara in Maseches Sota in the first chapter says, Tana, it was taught in a brisa, Hulam la milchama bo'u. All of them came to fight a war, and we'll see what that means in a moment. Kevan shero'u kisro shel Yosef, since they saw the crown of Yosef, toloi ba'arono shel Yaakov, hanging on the casket of Yaakov, notlu kulam kisrehem, they all took off their own crowns, v'chule, etc. The part that is left out from that Gemara is they took their own crowns and they put it on Yaakov's casket as well. So Yaakov's casket was covered with thrones. So now let's just pause for a moment. The Zera Shimshon assumes that we're very familiar with this Gemara. In case we're not very familiar with this Gemara, it tells the following amazing episode. It says that when Yosef and his brothers brought Yaakov's Aron, his casket, to bury their father in the Maras HaMachpelah, all of the kings of Canaan, the kings from all over the country of Canaan, came to fight a war and to say, we're not going to allow this. We're not going to allow you to come here and to bury this man in Maras HaMachpelah. This is our land. This is our country. You're foreigners. However, Yosef took off his crown. Of course, he wore a crown because he was the viceroy to Paro in Mitzrayim. So he took off his crown and he put it on his father's Aron. And when these kings of Canaan saw that, they took off their own crowns and put their crowns on the casket as well. And they accepted the fact that this group had come to bury Yaakov, that Yaakov's children had come to bury him in Maras HaMachpelah, and they accepted that fact. So Chazal teach us that that's why the place was called Goren Ha'atad, the threshing floor of thorns, of thorn bushes, because all of the crowns on top of Yaakov's casket looked like thorn bushes sticking up, the way that crowns have the points sticking up in the air. And so it was called that, not just because physically it was a location that had thorns around it. It's true that there was a literal location that was a threshing area with thorn bushes around it, but also to commemorate this amazing incident where the kings came ready to fight, but then took off their crowns and put the crowns on the casket of Yaakov and acquiesced to what was happening. Now let's go back to the Zera Shimshon. Koshe, there's a problem. Im hoyusa kavonosum lovo lamilchama, if their intention was to come and fight a war, kedei la'akev kivuraso shel Yaakov be'osa hame'ora, in order to prevent Yaakov being buried in the cave, if that's why they came, if that was their intention, and they were ready to fight to prevent Yaakov being his sons burying him in the Maras HaMachpelah, Kamosha Kosav Maharsha, as the great Talmudic commentator Maharsha states, so Ayin Sham, you can see there in his commentary, Eich bishvil zeh, how is it that because of this, meaning how is it that just because Yosef took off his crown and put it on his father's casket, nehev chadatam, their minds were changed from what they had in mind in the beginning? So the Zera Shimshon says we have a very fundamental, basic question here. Just to understand the story that the Gemara in the first parak in Sota teaches us, how does it make sense? How are we to understand the story? The kings came ready to fight a war, which means they must have had troops and weapons, and they're coming prepared to fight and attack this group that came from Mitzrayim. And they see Yosef's crown on the Aron, on the casket of Yaakov, and they decide that's it, no more war, no more fighting, and they even take off their own crowns and accept what's happening and put their crowns to join Yosef's crown. How does that make sense? How are we supposed to understand the story? Next paragraph. V'yesh lomar, and we can say, de belav hachi kosha al Yosef. Without this question that we just asked, there's another question on Yosef's actions. Lama hiniach kisro be'arono shel Yaakov. Why did he place his crown on the casket of Yaakov, of his father? Why did he do that? V'haksiv, it is written in a pasuk in Koheles, ein shilton biyom hamaves. There is no rulership on the day of death. Meaning that even someone as powerful as a monarch, on the day that the king dies, the king loses all of his power. He's no longer a ruler. He has no power left on the day that he dies. So since that's the case, what did Yosef mean by taking off his crown and putting it on his father's kever? His father had died. So what is Yosef trying to say? There was no rulership. There was no power left for Yaakov to be treated like a king or viewed like a person with royal power or royal prerogatives because he had passed away. V'tzorech lomar, and we need to say, Sherotza lehaniach kisro al arono, that Yosef wanted to place his crown on his father's casket, kedei lirmos, in order to hint, Yaakov avinu lo mes, that Yaakov, our forefather, did not die. And you can see in the parentheses, that's a quote from the Gemara in Maseches Tanis, and that's a statement by Chazal. As strange and unusual and cryptic as a statement could be, Yaakov did not die. We're reading about the burial of Yaakov, and we're reading about his body being brought from the land of Mitzrayim to be buried in the cave of Machpelah in Eretz Canaan, and Chazal tell us he didn't die. But don't forget, we saw the pasuk in which it specifically, the Torah specifically did not use the word vayomas, that Yaakov died. It used other terms that are certainly terms that indicate someone's leaving this world, but it didn't use the word. It didn't use the word mace. It didn't use the word that would tell us that he died. So Yosef wanted to hint to this by putting his crown on his father's casket. V'zehu simon muvhak. And this was an excellent sign. Shedafka hu ro'oi likaver b'maras hamachpelah, that he specifically, Yaakov specifically, was the one who it was appropriate to bury in the cave of Machpelah. V'lo Esav, and not Esav. There were those who claimed that they wanted to prevent Yaakov from being buried in Maras HaMachpelah because they felt Esav should have been buried there. But we're seeing that Yosef was saying, no, I'm taking off my crown and putting it on my father Yaakov's Aron to show, to indicate, to hint to everyone that he did not die, and therefore he's the one who should be buried in Maras HaMachpelah. Of course, as Zera Shimshon is going to explain these ideas. V'kevon she'osam hamalachim ro'uzeh, and since those kings, those Canaanite kings, saw this, they saw what Yosef did, hevinu be'atzmam hadover hazeh, they understood on their own this thing, sheYaakov adayin hu chai, that Yaakov Avinu was in some sense still alive. Here was his casket. They were looking at his casket. They knew that the family had come to bury him in Maras HaMachpelah, but they understood that the hidden meaning of Yosef's placing of his crown on top of the casket was to say, our father Yaakov has not died in a certain sense, and therefore he should still be treated like a king. This crown can go on his coffin, can go on his casket, because he hasn't died completely in the complete sense as other people die. He's still alive in a certain sense. V'nis yaru, and the kings were afraid. Umishum hachi nevcha datam, and therefore their minds were changed. Mima shahaya batchila, from what they thought in the beginning. Shahayu svurim shemes Yaakov. They thought Yaakov had died, in fact, in every possible way. And now, from Yosef's actions, they realized and they deduced that Yosef was saying to them, be careful, because Yaakov did not completely die. He's still alive. Adayin hu chai. He's still alive in a certain sense. And therefore, be careful what you do here. He deserves to be buried in Maras HaMachpelah, and the kings of Canaan accepted that. Next paragraph. V'hatam hu, and the reason is, meaning the reason that Yaakov deserved to be buried, clearly deserved to be buried in Maras HaMachpelah, shahare hashlosha avos tiknu hapagam, all three of the avos, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, repaired the damage she'osa Adam Harishon, that Adam Harishon had done when he committed the sin of eating from the Eitz Hadas Tov V'Ra, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that sin is viewed as a sin ba'avodah zara, giloy arayus u'shvichas domim. It's taught in the sefer, in the Kabbalistic svarim, that what Adam Harishon did when he ate from the Eitz Hadas was as if he had committed the three cardinal sins of idol worship, sexual immorality, and murder. Avodah zara, giloy arayos, and shvichas domim. Kemoshe kosav ba'asara ma'moros, as it's written in the Kabbalistic sefer Asara Ma'moros, Ma'amar Chikor Din Chelek Gimel, Ma'amar Chikor Din, and the section called Chikor Din Chelek Gimel, the third part, Perek Yud Zayin, the 17th chapter of Ayin Shum, and you should look there to see more about this. But the point is that from the perspective of the Kabbalah, from the perspective of the Zohar, Adam Arishon's sin, as we said, had aspects of avodah zara, giloy arayos, and shvichas domim included in it, and the avos, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, dedicated themselves to being mesakein, to repairing the damage done by what Adam Harishon had done in those three areas of avodah zara, giloy arayos, and shvichos domim. Continuing, v'shivchon shel avos hu Yaakov, and the most praiseworthy of the forefathers was Yaakov. K'de'isa by Zohar bekama makomos, as it states in the Zohar in several places, that Yaakov Avinu, the third of the patriarchs, was considered the choice one, the nivchar, the choicest of the avos. V'lo od, and not only this, ela she'odam harishon hevi ilona demosa la'alma. Adam Arishon brought a tree of death to the world. Adam Arishon brought death into the world. Ve'Yakov tafas be'ilona dechaye. And Yaakov held on tightly to the tree of life. Mishum hachi isa by Zohar. And because of this, it states in the Zohar Parshas Vayishlach Daf Kuf Samech Ches, on Parshas Vayishlach, on page 168, Deman dechazi Yaakov bechalma, a person who sees Yaakov Avinu in his dream, chayin mitosvan le, years of life will be added to that person, v'ayin sham, and see there. So we have a theme here being developed that Yaakov Avinu, as the third of the avos, was able to complete the tikkun, the spiritual repair of the pagam, of the damage done by Adam Harishon, and Avraham had done his share of the work in his lifetime, and Yitzchak had done his share of the work of repair in his lifetime, and Yaakov completed the work to such a degree that he was considered the choicest of the avos, and it was as if he brought life back into the world after death had been introduced to the world by the sin of Adam Harishon. Next paragraph. Umeata, and from now that we understand these ideas, hoil she'ha'avos tiknu ha'pegomim shel Adam Harishon, since the patriarchs repaired the damages that had been caused by Adam Harishon, min ha'ro'oi hu, it is only appropriate sheyihu nikbarim etzlo b'mara, that all of the avos, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, should be buried next to Adam Harishon in the cave. We know that Chazal teach us that the four zugos, the four pairs, were buried in Maras HaMachpelah, Adam and Chava, and then later Avram and Sarah, Yitzchak and Rivka, and Yaakov and Leah. And so Zera Shimshon is saying it is of the utmost appropriateness and relevance and significance that the avos should be buried in Maras HaMachpelah with Adam Harishon and Chava, because they repaired the damage that Adam did, and so they should all be viewed kind of as a unit. They should all be together. Lo chen Esav, and this doesn't apply to Esav. She'adarabba, because just the opposite, Kilkel, he brought destruction, velo tikein klum, and he did not repair anything. As a matter of fact, Chazal teach us that Esav was involved in the same three cardinal averos and sins that were mentioned above, avodah zarah, gilui arayos, and shvichas damim. So Esav's actions and activities in his lifetime were very far removed and actually the opposite of bringing any kind of spiritual repair and tikkun to what damage had been caused by Adam Harishon. Ve'ikar hashevach shel Yaakov, and the main idea behind the praise and choiceness and specialness of Yaakov, hainu, it is lefi shehoyasa mitaso shlema, because his bed was complete. What does it mean his bed was complete? Shelo hoya shum dofi bevonav. There was no falseness, no corruption in his sons. Kimoshar ha'avos, as there were in the other avos. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. Umishum hachi amru beperakama disanis, and because of this distinction about Yaakov Avinu, it says in the Gemara and Tanis that we mentioned before, Mazaro b'chaim, afhu b'chaim. Just like Yaakov's children are alive, he is alive. So what this idea means is that, of course, we know Avraham brought Yitzchak, Avram and Sarah brought Yitzchak into the world, but Yitzchak wasn't Avram's first child. Avram Avinu had married Hagar and had a child, Yishmael. And Yishmael was not part of the Jewish people, even though he was a child of Avram Avinu. And Yitzchak, so too, had a child named Esav. And Esav was not a part of the Jewish people, even though he was a child of Yitzchak and Rivka. And only Yaakov could point to his 12 sons and say, all of my children, my entire family completely are part of the Jewish people and will carry on the traditions and the blessings of the Jewish people, and the destiny of the Jewish people will be carried on through my children and through their descendants. That only applied to Yaakov. And the Zera Shimshon is saying to us, that is the secret of why Yaakov was called the choicest of the avos, and why Chazal say Yaakov Avinu lo mes. In what sense did Yaakov Avinu not die? Because he was the only one of the avos whose children were all carried on the tradition of Hashem's Mesorah, and had full membership in the Jewish people, and became the 12 tribes. And therefore, as the Gemara says, Mazaro b'chaim, Yaakov Avinu's children lived on, and all of them lived on as part of the Jewish people, afhu b'chaim. This means that Yaakov himself, differently than Avraham and Yitzchak, as great and as incredible and foundational as they were, only Yaakov could point to all of his children being part of Bnei Yisrael, and therefore, as long as Bnei Yisrael continues to live, so too Yaakov continues to live. Next paragraph. Ve'od, additionally, lefi shehu gemar hatikun, since Yaakov completed the repair, Masha'ein kain Avram v'Yitzchak, which could not be said about Avram and Yitzchak. Avraham started the work, as we said, and Yitzchak continued the work, but they were not able to complete the work. Shelo tiknu ella, they were only able to repair. Next page, top on the right, avodah zarah v'shvichas domim. We say that Avraham repaired the sin of the aspect of avodah zarah that was part of the Chet of Adam Harishon, and the way that this is generally understood is because Avraham was so opposed to idol worship and idolatry that he broke his father's idols, according to the Medrash, according to Chazal, and he also was willing to risk his life to be thrown into the fiery furnace by Nimrod in order to not give in and even consider worshiping idols. So he was Mesakein, he brought spiritual repair to that aspect. Ushvichas damim, Yitzchak brought tikkun and repair to shvichas damim, to murder, by offering himself up willingly at the Akedah to give his own life for that. And that was viewed as a tikkun of shvichas damim. V'adayin nishar lesakein gilui arayos. After what Avram and Yitzchak did, the aspect of gilui arayos, of sexual immorality, still needed to be repaired, and that was repaired by Yaakov Avinu by the fact that he was willing to work for 7 years in order to marry Leah, or in order to marry who he thought would be Rachel, but he married Leah and stayed married to her in order to begin to build up his family, and was committed to work another 7 years for Rachel. And so he was being Masakein Gilui Arayos by committing to these pure, highly spiritual women and marrying them along with Bilhah and Zilpah, of course, to build the family and the house that he built. Ubahachi nicha, and with this, it makes sense. Mashikosav ha'iyun Yaakov, what the commentator Iyun Yaakov wrote. Shehalamid vav kisarim, the fact that there were 36 crowns. That's going back to the story of the Canaanite kings. Chazal teach us there were 36 Canaanite kings that came to oppose what Yosef and his brothers wanted to do. And they put their 36 crowns on the casket of Yaakov after they saw Yosef's crown there. Heim lirmo shnei pa'amim chai chai. That's to hint, 36 hints to 18 and 18, chai and chai, life and life. Ba'olam hazeh uva'olam haba. Yaakov Avinu when Yaakov Avinu left this world, when his body expired, he didn't just have life in Olam Haba. His life in this world continued, because his life was inextricably bound up with the lives of all of his children and their descendants. And therefore he continued to live, not just in the sense of living in Olam Haba, but also in the sense of living in Olam Hazeh. And that's what Yosef was hinting to when he took off his crown and put it and placed it lovingly on the casket of his father, Yaakov. Yasher Koch for joining in the learning this week, and we look forward, God willing, to learning again in the Zera Shimshon on next week's Parsha.